In this video, we're looking at 7 ways that Asperger Syndrome is commonly misunderstood, so that by the end of the video, you'll be able to understand a person with Asperger Syndrome like a pro. Right at the end of the video, I'll be asking a question how you would personally describe somebody with autism. What's going on with my hair? Hey, what's up? I'm Dan. I have Asperger Syndrome, OCD, ADHD and dyslexia. I make weekly videos on autism and mental health and some tips and tricks thrown in. So if you're new around here, why not click that subscribe button so you don't miss out on any more videos. It's also worth noting that the camera and all the equipment I use is linked in the description below, so check that out if you're interested. Welcome back, everybody. It feels like it's been forever since we last had a video. I miss all you guys. And I think it's been like that because it's been so cold, and it's been so cold, it snowed like crazy, but it's all gone, it's all dried up now, but I thought my fingers were going to fall off the other day. And I'm just about ready for summer. Okay, so let's dive into this video. So basically, I compiled a list of misconceptions or misunderstandings that people have generally about Asperger Syndrome, because I feel like this is something that needs to be discussed and needs to be kind of educated, because a lot of people say these things and not really understand it, or see someone with Asperger Syndrome and not really understand what Asperger Syndrome is, or how somebody with Asperger Syndrome is impacted by the things that they say. So this kind of video is to do away with some of the common myths and misconceptions about Asperger Syndrome, and I think you'll enjoy it. Oh, and don't forget to share this video if you found it helpful and think it can help somebody else. Here we go, 7 Asperger Syndrome misconceptions. Number 1 is Rain Man. Now, the reason I said Rain Man is because there's this thing where if you tell somebody that you have an autism spectrum disorder, or you have Asperger Syndrome, or anything like that, they always think, oh, you're like Rain Man, you know, you eat your dinner with toothpicks, and you're good at counting cards, and that is pretty much everyone's perception of what is somebody with an autism spectrum disorder. Well, they are basically Rain Man, and this is not true. You know, so Rain Man is actually a savant, and the savant is at the lowest end of the autism spectrum, and it's kind of not really a commonly accepted as an autism condition. Yes, it is autism, but it's not in the autism spectrum. It's right down the bottom, and it's actually called Savantism. And Savantism is where the person has an intellectual disability, and they are faced with this disability, and it impacts their life in a number of ways. Like, they may not be able to communicate or get dressed on their own, or even sometimes eat on their own, and all these kind of things, but they do excel in a certain area. And there's only about 7 savants in the world, if I remember correctly. I've actually met one of them, a guy called David Paravicini, and I met him when I was speaking at an autism conference, and he was there doing a performance as well, and he's a really nice guy, but it's, you know, it's a huge step away from a typical autism spectrum disorder, and it's actually just called Savantism. So yeah, that's number 1. Like, no, it's not Rain Man. Okay, so number 2 is mathematics. Everybody thinks that if you have autism or Asperger Syndrome, then you're going to be this like super genius mathematician, you know. And although I really enjoy mathematics and chemistry, not everybody on the autism spectrum is into mathematics. Now, I know people who have Asperger Syndrome and they don't like maths, or they're no good at maths, or they feel like they're not really interested in maths, and that's totally fine. But a lot of people think that just because you have an autism spectrum condition, you're going to be this mathematician genius. And it's not really fair, because it kind of puts a lot of people under pressure to think that, oh, maybe they're no good at life, or they're failing at life, because these people think that because you have this condition, you must be good at maths. And yeah, no, not everybody who has autism is good at maths. Okay, so number 3 is that Asperger Syndrome doesn't exist anymore. Now, this is one I get a lot of comments about on my channel, and people say, hey, you know, Asperger Syndrome doesn't exist anymore. Or some people will say to someone, oh, I've told somebody about my diagnosis, and they say that Asperger's doesn't exist, and you're thinking, what on earth is going on? Now, the reason behind this, as much as I can gather, is that when the DSM-5 came out, which is the mental health practitioner's kind of guide of how you diagnose somebody with a mental health condition or a neurological condition like Asperger Syndrome and autism, they basically said that Asperger Syndrome was taken out of there as a terminology and put into just the autism spectrum, because there was basically tons of different naming or nomenclature that was put into diagnosing somebody with an autism spectrum condition. But because there was so many and they're so varied, they wanted to channel it to just being the autism spectrum condition title. So now the official terminology for diagnosing somebody with Asperger syndrome is autism spectrum disorder. But that doesn't mean that Asperger syndrome doesn't exist. Just because they change the name of something or they stop using a name, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, and it doesn't mean that the person is lying. That person definitely does have that condition, and nothing else has changed, just the name of it on a diagnostic paper. So that is something that really kind of comes up a lot, and I think this is a massive common misconception that needs addressing. Okay, so number 4 is quite an interesting one. It's basically where people think that they'll brush off Asperger syndrome as being, oh, that's an excuse for you to be misbehaving or naughty or rude or whatever, or socially awkward, and they don't accept the fact that somebody with Asperger syndrome will have social interaction issues or an impact in their social and public behavior. And it's not that they're rude, it's not that they're arrogant, it's just because they have this condition. It's a neurological condition. So a lot of people will be like, oh, that person's super rude, and you'll be like, well, look, they actually have an autism spectrum condition, give them a break. And then they'll be like, oh, no, that's just stupid, that's just an excuse, and they'll dismiss it. And a lot of people are like this. They'll dismiss it as being just this excuse that people use to actually get away with being rude or socially awkward or not really engaging in the conversations. And this is something that really bugs me, and I've come across people like this before, and they're just uneducated and not really open to the fact. And I just want to put it out there that people with Asperger syndrome are not rude and are not obnoxious and they're not misbehaving. This is just how their brain works, and this is how that they experience life. It may not be how you experience life, but that doesn't mean that it's wrong. It just means that that person has some issues or some difficulties that you may not have experienced at all. So just have some patience, and it's something I just want to clear up. And I think it's something that we should all kind of take on board, that have a little bit more patience with people on the autism spectrum. So number 5 is quite an interesting one. A lot of people think that because you're on the autism spectrum, you can't drive, that's it. So if you say to someone, hey, yeah, I've got Asperger syndrome, they'll be like, oh, so you can't drive? It's like, well, no, nobody's chopped my fingers and feet off. I can definitely drive. I just, may need some extra help, or it may take me a little bit longer to learn to drive. Okay, so, granted that some people on the autism spectrum and with Asperger syndrome may not want to drive, or they feel that they can't really get into driving and it doesn't really click in their head, and that's fine, because driving isn't for everybody. Not every single person in the world can drive, but you've got just as much chance of learning to drive and being successful at it having an autism spectrum condition just as you have if you don't have one. And that's how I feel about it. And I drive, and I've met a bunch of other people in autism conferences that do drive, and it's so liberating for people with Asperger syndrome to say, hey, I can drive, and it's good, and don't have this kind of perception that people with Asperger syndrome can't drive. And I just want to clear that. I think that one's quite an important one as well, because if you say, oh, some people might actually get offended and be like, well, you can't have Asperger syndrome or an autism disorder because you can drive a car. It's like, well, that's got nothing to do with it. So I just thought I'd put that one out there. Now, this is one of the ones that really bugs me, and I've heard this so many times. So a lot of people believe that autism is only present in children, and they say, oh, you can grow out of it. Asperger syndrome, yeah, you just grow out of Asperger syndrome. It's like, what are you talking about? Of course you can't grow out of Asperger syndrome. It's a neurological lifelong disorder, and in actual fact, it doesn't get better over time. In most cases, it actually gets a little bit worse over time, because the older you get, the worse things can become. And this is something that people really, really need to realize, that Asperger syndrome is not just present in children. Those children grow up to be adults, and they have the same issues and the same struggles that they would have had as being a child, because the condition is just exactly the same. There's no difference. Your brain doesn't kind of like mend the bits that are kind of a bit different. It just keeps it as it is, and that's how it always has been. So no, it's not just children who have autism, and no, people cannot grow out of Asperger syndrome, and that is something that everybody really needs to remember. Okay, so the last one here, which is point number 7, is that people think that because you don't look them in the eyes, you're being super, super rude. Now, people with Asperger syndrome have a difficulty in looking people in the eyes. So making eye contact and keeping that eye contact for a long period of time is super stressful. It's very distressing for someone with Asperger syndrome and people on the autism spectrum. And because of this, you when you're speaking to somebody of authority or profession, it's difficult to make eye contact with them. I kind of look to the side of their face, maybe their forehead or their cheek or their nose. It's difficult to look in the eye, because looking in the eye is such a bizarrely personal thing, and I've done a whole video on how it feels. Eye contact, like social issues where social gestures, they could be hand gestures or body movements. People on the autism spectrum actually have a hard time distinguishing those non-verbal characteristics and gestures, and are kind of at a loss with it. and I'll link that above here in a card, and you can check out what it's like to actually look someone in the eye when you have an autism spectrum condition. But it doesn't mean that it's disrespectful or rude. If somebody doesn't look you in the eye, it doesn't mean that they're being rude or disrespectful. It just means that, hey, this person may have an issue with looking people in the eye because it's a neurological thing, not that it's a arrogant thing or a disrespect thing. And I've had this before. I was doing an interview on TV with Piers Morgan, and he was talking to me about my book I had out. And if you're interested in my book, I've linked it below in the description. But when we were talking about my book, there was a bunch of comments coming in on Twitter, and some people were saying like, oh, Dan's being really disrespectful to Piers because he won't look him in the eyes. And it wasn't that I was being disrespectful, it's just because I've never met the guy before. It was the first time meeting him. I can't look in this guy's eyes. It's so difficult, and it is a big thing. So always remember that if somebody's not looking you in the eyes, it doesn't mean that they're disrespectful. It just means that, hey, this person may have issues with eye contact. Okay, so I said at the end of the video I'd ask you guys a question on how you would prefer personally to describe somebody on the autism spectrum. So here's the question, and you can leave your answers in the comment section below. Would you say an autistic person, or would you say a person with autism? I'd love to know your opinion, so please put it in the comment section below, and let's roll the end screen.